So from the sometimes village, sometimes city tourism bureaus, provincial bureaus, and then full central government organs, and even state-owned businesses. We're all trying to hire people to do their overseas social media influence work for them. The breadth of how large of a business model this is, it shows that everybody really cares very much about how they're appearing on Western social media, and very few of them have the skill set to do that.
How does the PRC get its message out abroad? To discuss, we have the winner of the inaugural Rhodium China Talk essay contest, recent college grad,
Maggie Bachman,
author of the absolutely fantastic senior thesis, Selling China's Story Well. Co-hosting today is Jeff Cao, a computational journalist at ProPublica, who has also done some reporting on CCP overseas propaganda.
So yeah, Maggie, that was a great paper we read, and I think the title of it was really interesting. Let's start with that. Why did you call it Selling China's Story Well?
The original line is telling China's story well. I remember that being something that Xi Jinping would tell Chinese state-owned media outlets, that it was, one of their missions was to tell China's story well. And my title is a bit of a riff off of that. It's talking more about how increasingly China and Chinese government organs are paying private marketing firms, internet firms, and even their own state-owned media companies to advertise for China, basically packaging and selling China like a product and trying to tell China's story as if it is a product they're trying to market to the outside world.
That's great. And that's a little different from, what we see or what we consider to be influence operations from countries like Russia and Iran, right? How's it different?
Yeah, it's absolutely pretty different. And I think that's one of the reasons that Chinese influence operations haven't gotten a ton of attention in the past. Or I think another big flaw with the way that we've looked at them in the past is that we would default back to one or two examples that we know about. And then we try to make big claims about how China's influencing, Western social media everywhere we go and things like that. I think a lot of times we lack the data to make those claims. And I think a lot of the issues that we're looking for, the same types of operations that we've seen coming out of Russia and Iran. And while Russia and Iran are trying to prey on social divisions in a way, trying to undermine the Western society or the Western governance system or whatever using our social media, China's really not trying to do that. China's really focused on how the West sees China and trying to shape China's image abroad, rather than trying to change the way that, Americans or Westerners feel about their own country. It's much more of a positive messaging campaign aimed at shaping the way that we view China.
I think the first question that comes to mind is, what's wrong with a country trying to promote itself on the world stage, right? We see, Middle Eastern countries sponsoring soccer teams and things like that.
We got the Voice of America.
Sure.
A lot of the things that I'm studying and flagging, things that come under the propaganda umbrella broadly, are the same kinds of things that American cities engage in all the time. You'll get tourism ads for different American cities all the time. I think trying to look at the ways that China does that a little differently. By and large, I don't know if it's, necessarily a huge problem that China is trying to shape its image abroad, but it is something to be aware of a lot of times, because in shaping its story, it tries to hide a lot of the parts that would receive criticism from the outside. I think one of the things that comes to mind the most is the ways that they shape advertising, tourism advertising, economic development advertising around Xinjiang. There are all of these, video campaigns and advertising campaigns by state-owned media outlets on Western social media about the happy Uyghurs and, how Muslims are being trained so that they can, really provide for their families, or so that they are able to really live harmonious, happy lives. And we know that that is not the case for a lot of people, that there is forced labor happening in Xinjiang, and a lot of the ways that China is using tourism advertising, things that are permitted on Facebook according to its advertising regulations, to shape the ways that we view regions like Xinjiang and China's governance there.
So I'd like to take a step back, Maggie. I did my own sort of version of this during the pandemic, which was just downloading all the Twitter bots that Twitter had gathered and said, oh, these are Chinese state affiliated. You did such a better job than I did as a 21-year-old looking into this question. I would love to hear you talk about your research process, how you thought about gathering materials, where were some of the more interesting places that you uncovered and the documents that you were able to weave together to tell this broader story of how China tries to protect itself in Western media?
First, I think that is too kind. And I will say I actually started by playing with Twitter data. I think the Twitter data was such a cool discovery when when they first released it, and it's available to play with and download from their data sets, which is available online. That's great. But I think one of the things that struck me was that it was definitely starting with whatever was the most observable, the most egregious. If it's egregious enough to be raising the red flags for social media companies, there's got to be more low level stuff out there that isn't getting flagged. And we especially know that they're not all that sensitive or great about pulling down disinformation. It's way harder to spot when it's coming in regions or languages that they're not experts in and don't tend to have the same expertise. So actually, I will say that the data set that I discovered, so I was working with government public procurement documents. And that actually came about because of an article I read by Jeff. So I remember him flagging in a ProPublica piece that was published almost 2 years ago at this point, I guess, that he had found that that one site, which is one of the companies that was running Twitter accounts that were active in Hong Kong, that company had previously made a deal or had been contracted by the China News Service. He linked to a public procurement document that showed this. And I was really interested in that idea. I was like, wow, this is out in the open. This is crazy. I wonder if there are more. Turns out there are more. And I ended up finding, actually, the research process was a bit of a hassle. Chinese government web pages don't like it when foreign IP addresses try to scrape their websites. So I ended up having to use workarounds like public procurement aggregators that would take local, regional, provincial, every level of government procurement contracts and make them all publicly available if you register for an account. So I ended up scraping one of these aggregators, and I ended up with a lot more contracts available for a longer period of time.
Listeners might not be very familiar with sort of the tender process in China and sort of how these contracts come about and are published online. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the Chinese government, partly because it would like to be added to an international government public procurement trade agreement, basically, has been working on making its deals with private companies much more transparent. So as in the US, but I didn't even know this before I did this kind of research, government organs who would like to buy services of any kind, ranging from like buying new desks for a government office to, turns out, buying services where someone will manage their Facebook page for a year. They will put out calls for bids, basically, and then they'll give a time frame where interested and qualified companies can apply and submit proposals. Then they will choose a winner. There's also an option for single source procurement where they will have identified who they would like to work with beforehand. And because they're such a standout, cannot be beaten in price, or just like have a skill set no one else has, they'll be picked without even having to compete. And actually that happens quite frequently for overseas social media work. They have a couple preferred contractors that they will give preferential treatment to.
Great. So how many contracts did you find? What was the time period? What did that look like overall to begin with?
And Maggie, after looking under the hood, I'm curious whether you think this is a good business to be in.
Definitely a good business to be in. The market is definitely expanding, and there are more and more companies that are winning these bids every year, and more bids coming out from all over the country. So I scraped using an aggregator called Bid Center, and I scraped starting in 2013. So that was the first time that I found it. The timeline actually goes back to 2007. But the first government contract that I found that was looking for the keyword search that I was using was 海外社交媒体, which is overseas social media. The first contract that involved that term came in 2013, and I started with that one and went all the way through to the end of 2020. So I ended up with 554 separate contracts. And those are not all final result contracts. Some of those were call for bids, some of those were single source procurement announcements, and some of those were like, here are the results. sometimes they had to call for bids twice or three times because no qualified suppliers were applying. It's a pretty interesting collection of documents with varying levels of detail.
What did you find at a high level?
So there are, I think one of the most interesting things I found was this is not really happening in one place or at one level of government. We're finding that in like every province, at every level, so from the like village, sometimes village, sometimes city tourism bureaus, provincial bureaus, and then national full central government organs, and even state-owned businesses. We're all trying to hire people to do their overseas social media influence work for them. And I think the breadth of like how large of a business model this is, how widespread it is, and kind of there were airlines who wanted to pay for these services. There were tourism bureaus, there were cultural bureaus, there were propaganda bureaus. Really, I think it shows that everybody really cares very much about how they're appearing on Western social media, and very few of them have the skill set to do that.
It's kind of weird, though, isn't it? I mean, it's just like, what does this town really need? Like, are they really going to get Western tourists to be lured in through Twitter? Do you have any sense, Maggie, of like the underlying bureaucratic logic of like doing this just because like it makes you look cool and serious and international?
A lot of it has to do with economic development. While I'm phrasing it as tourism advertising, and often it's coming from the tourism bureaus, and often the tourism bureaus and economic development bureaus are kind of intertwined. They're not just advertising like it's pretty, we have nice hotels, and you'll have a nice vacation here. They're advertising like cultural diversity, good governance, stable location, harmonious society. They use kind of the same key terms over and over again, and they go far beyond what you'd really need if you were looking for a vacation. They're trying to shape this idea of what this town is, what it means to be, a town in this region of China, what it means to be a town in China, and what China looks like as a whole. So I think it's starting on the minute level, and sometimes they'll even point to central government directives to increase tourism, increase advertising, increase economic development. This is how they're doing it. They're shaping their image, making themselves seem more desirable. I mean, we all know that if you're going to travel somewhere, you're going to Google it first, and they kind of want to be the people controlling those results.
I think when we think about sort of influence operations online, like you said before, your mind sort of goes to Twitter automatically, right? But in your data set, you found sort of a different result, right? That it wasn't just people looking to, increase their reach on Twitter.
No. So definitely the most prevalent platform mentioned on their overseas social media contracts was Facebook. Facebook was appearing at like double the rate of other platforms. Facebook was often mentioned alone, but there was never a time where like a Twitter was mentioned or an Instagram was mentioned by itself. If you were going to include Western social media platforms, they were starting with Facebook. And actually, it was very interesting after digging into that. I was very curious about why that was true. It seems like there are some underlying reasons to that. After doing a lot of digging, I found a very strange website called reachtheworldonfacebook.com. Last I checked, it is still available on the internet, even though I've now talked to Facebook representatives about it. And reachtheworldonfacebook.com allows Chinese businesses to connect with local advertising resellers who will advertise for them on social media platforms, even though the platform is banned in China. So these government bureaus and state-owned entities usually can't access Facebook.com. It is blocked by the Great Firewall. So in order to get their message out on Western social media, they will be paying Facebook resellers who are licensed by Facebook and they have special trainings by Facebook and special tools they can access through Facebook. And they'll be paying them to do their advertising for them and target specific groups. Like Friendly Shandong was targeting adventurous Australian beer drinkers.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a nice little WordPress site. We've got like a scrolling header, it's full width, much more modern than what I would expect from a Chinese bureaucratic procurement homepage.
The guy who built it works in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong base. I think he might have actually been a contractor, but he advertises it on his LinkedIn page. So that's on him. I don't know. They are expanding. So the profits from China added up to 5 billion in 2017, an estimated, which would make China their second largest market outside of the United States. And it's all advertising because that's all they're doing from China, even though they're not doing it in China. It's a lot of money. It's a huge market.
Maggie, can you talk about some of the different providers that were providing these services. Overseas social media work requires a certain sort of language facility and expertise with these platforms that are banned in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what I found is there are two main types of firms, companies that were qualified to do this work. And the first is state-owned media giants. So even though they're advertising, this privatized platform, they're advertising this privatized version of it, you can compete for it. The people who are winning these bids are often the Xinhua News Agency, China Daily, and People's Daily. Actually, I think the three of those two together won more than 40% of the contracts. Because they have this reach and they've proven ability to work in Chinese and English and kind of communicate with clients. They have a lot of trust from government clients in their ability to execute the message that they want them to execute. So they build a lot of websites too. That's one of their big things. They build websites for local tourism bureaus and things like that.
Do you think these folks are getting their money's worth out of the Xinhuas and Renmin or Baos of the world?
I mean, it's hard to tell as someone who now sees those names and immediately discounts the message in some ways. But I think a lot of times when their name isn't on it, and a lot of times their name won't be on it, these pretty pictures of gorgeous sunsets over mountains somewhere in China, they have a formula, and the formula seems to be working fairly well. I guess one thing that I think was kind of important to talk about is I found that the way that these were working was a combination. It's a little bit of an academic tangent, but there are kind of two scholars who've been talking about ways that China shapes messaging abroad. And I found that those two kind of came together really well in this data set. And the first was Anne-Marie Brady, who wrote almost 20 years ago about nation branding as nation building. And this whole idea of when it came to China and how you can kind of form a picture of China that you want to then advertise to the world. And I do think there's this coherent message. There's the same phrases. There's the same formula of pictures. There's a lot of pandas, a lot of sunsets, a lot of happy workers. And it's the same thing happening no matter what the city is. You could probably swap out the title. Sometimes you literally have the same slogan. If you just swap out the city name, you get a similar advertising campaign for all of them. And the other one is, I think, what explains why this is happening and why they keep doing this, what makes it effective, is someone who sees this and I don't really feel like it's doing all that much. Molly Roberts wrote in her book Censored about flooding, where you kind of take over a topic. I think it was used in Tibetan, Free Tibet discourse, where China found a hashtag and then just overwhelmed it with pro-China content, basically. And so if people are talking about Xinjiang, and the way they're talking about Xinjiang is always associated with forced labor and Uyghurs, China wants to take Xinjiang and they want to make it something associated with great business development, increasing quality of life, and harmonious society. And so they're going to pay people to kind of overwhelm that topic on Western social media until your gut level immediate association with the word Xinjiang is not this picture of forced labor or these satellite images. It's this video you saw that came up on your Facebook feed of someone saying that China changed my life by giving me these education courses. So I think that's kind of how it works. I'm not sure how effective it is, but it's definitely a different tactic than we're seeing coming out of Russia.
Yeah, it's interesting because you are probably one of the most sophisticated consumers of this on the planet now. So the fact that it's not the Jedi mind tricks no longer work on Maggie is not super surprising. You mentioned earlier that it wasn't just the Xinhuas and people's dailies of the world which get these contracts. Who are their sort of competitors in this space?
Yeah, so their competitors are these small internet startup companies that often, when they were first registered, so you can find their business registration, which is how I've kind of tracked them, because they don't often have a huge internet presence, despite the fact that they work on overseas social media. They start off as lots of very random things. They'll start off as tourism bureaus. They'll start off as photography sites. And then over time, they'll see that there's a space in the market where they could win government contracts for taking pictures for a purpose or advertising in a specific way. And so there are these startups that pivoted into the sector, won a government contract or two. Very few of them go on to win more than 1, 2, or 3 contracts. Sometimes they're renewed. So I'm not sure how successful they are in really becoming influential startups, but I guess they're probably undercutting some of their competitors, and they can do basic English language, access Western social media, and do the job of regularly posting and regularly bringing in views, whether those are real or artificial.
there's something about, Western social media that makes it sort of susceptible, right? In a way, because if you have a message, you have money, you can get your message across. So, you talk a little bit about sort of the information infrastructure in the US and how they target it. Can you unpack that a little bit?
I think this is where our system of tech regulation gets much more complicated. A lot of what I was finding and what we're kind of talking about is not overtly hostile, malign, or in many cases false. Talking about China's economic development is not fake news. It's not going to be flagged by Twitter like we're seeing increasingly, coronavirus misinformation being flagged. I think the challenge is the ways that, if you have enough, you can overwhelm a feed, or if you can overwhelm a topic. You have the ability to shape sentiments without ever doing anything that violates tech policies or tech companies, rules of use. So sometimes if it's advertising, it's explicitly permitted and encouraged. So I don't know if I guess that makes us more vulnerable than countries that have rules about who can post and have real name registration rules and other ways of restricting how information flows. But in a system of free information flow, the more you pay, the more information you have to put out there, the more influence you have.
If you don't like ads and want to support the show, click the Patreon link in the show notes and subscribe for an ad-free feed.
There were sort of other services that were being offered as well. Things that might look pretty familiar to someone who works in sort of social media marketing. Things like identifying key influencers and paying them, or, scraping public social media data and monitoring public opinion. Companies do that sort of thing all the time, right? How is it different in this context?
Yeah, monitoring overseas social media platforms for public opinion and things like that. I can't say that I necessarily found that to be particularly, malign indicator of malign behavior. We try to do the same all the time, trying to figure out, what's trending on Weibo these days. What are the topics that are happening? What are the topics that are, really up the moment? I do think the things that to me were more interesting were the purchasing of Western influencers. So one of my favorite examples that I kind of dug into was this very nondescript social media company. It won multiple contracts, which is why I found it interesting, called the Shenzhen Yishan cultural media company or something like that. It was very generic name, does not have a website. Only reason it's active is they've moved, offices in the last year. But it turns out they have an American branch that is much more public facing. It has gone through multiple iterations, gone through multiple names, and most recently it's called itself the March Lion Agency. And they have recruited a number of influencers, not like the most famous influencers, people who have significant followings who are probably more susceptible to good pay and willing to enter the Chinese market as well. So they brought a number of Western influencers onto Sino Weibo, set them up with profiles. Unlike many Westerners who tried to break in, they were very successful within almost less than a year. They pretty much only follow each other, and they've made this network of Westerners on Sino Weibo, but also, they clearly have ties to this company who has hired them to do influence work. They're famous on Instagram. They're making videos on YouTube. They're in fields like one guy into clay polymers. Mishti Rahman is a Muslim, I think, influencer. There's a couple grunge makeup influencers. So it really runs the gamut.
Yeah, it's interesting because generally when people think of Westerners in the pocket of the CCP, it's those folks making videos on YouTube talking about how Xinjiang is amazing and that's their whole channel, right? But what I found so interesting about this finding was that, it's not only that. It's not only those folks who are just explicitly pro CCP content that are in this big web of influence campaigns.
Yeah, it's a lot of people who are famous for something else, who I'm pretty sure got invited to an influencers night in New York where they got to take pictures with pretty unusual backgrounds, then got to strike some deals to enter Weibo. And from there, I'm not pointing to them and saying, they're advertising on behalf of the CCP on Facebook and here are the posts that have to prove it. And I'm not trying to throw those stones. I'm just saying that we know that they're working for this company. They're an influencer hired by and represented by this company that does social media work on Western platforms for the Chinese government.
You said earlier in the conversation that you've been in touch with Facebook in particular on this. How do you think they're managing it? And, if you were oversight board czar for the day, what would you potentially do differently?
I guess taking a step back, I will say there have been a range of responses, and some of them have been better than others. I will the Wall Street Journal was being flagged as like the major place where everyone wanted to get their advertising out there. They were paying people to make those connections with the Wall Street Journal and get these inserts printed in the Wall Street Journal that looked like, I think this was actually, they got in trouble for this. People yelled at them for this because they were publishing things that looked like they were news articles, but they were completely paid for by foreign news sources. I think,
which for the record, like, I am shocked by, and it's been going on for decades, and it kept going on even after all the journalists got kicked out of Beijing, which is just sort of incredible to me. I mean, Jeff, you're deeper in this. Yeah. I don't think ProPublica has any paid Chinese government inserts, but like, what was going on here for so long?
Actually, if you go to Xinhua's FARA filings, which they've started doing now, you can actually find all of the papers that they advertise in. I think Xinhua are People's Daily.
It was definitely interesting. I think their move to, as far as I know, they've stopped doing it. They said they were going to stop doing it. So I think that response, the like public pressure, like condemnation, and then like changing their ways was a good call. But it's a little different for a news source to be passing off things, advertisements, as their own reporting, and Facebook to be acting as Facebook claims to be, just a platform where you post things and like they're not responsible for the content.
What was Nick Clegg's line earlier this week? Like, it's like a car, or what? No, it was worse than a car. What did he say? Do you guys remember this?
This is definitely up for debate whether this is how Facebook operates, but they say that that's how they operate. They just let things happen, and if they happen, they were just acting as a public platform where everyone can share their opinions, like a bulletin board or whatever. Twitter has made it at least more efforts to create this transparency initiative, to release data sets, to acknowledge when it happens and take off numbers of users and allow you to use all the data, collaborating with scholars. And usually if a scholar like calls them out on it, those networks will often get removed. It doesn't really feel like Facebook is doing that. And in fact, it feels like Facebook is sort of doing the opposite, where they are explicitly like advertising in cooperation with Chinese companies who then are working directly with Chinese government clients. There was a beautiful New York Times picture, I think it was an article a couple years ago, where Meet Social, which is one of Facebook's advertising partners, had set up an exhibition. I think it was in Beijing. And they set up an exhibition and they're showing how their platform can be used. And people had a lot of these companies had never seen Facebook before. So you could scroll through a Facebook page and see what Facebook looked like. So you could see what an advertisement would look like and then pay Meet Social to do it. And there was a giant picture of Xi Jinping on the wall, and it was in a government exhibition center. So this idea that somehow Facebook is, sticking it to the Chinese government, or, willing to, take things down. I think their interests clearly lie in trying to find a way to work in the Chinese market. And this is how they found it. It doesn't really feel like their financial or corporate interests are aligned with taking down content. And the only times they do so is when there's enough of a public outcry about a specific video or a specific piece of content that they'll just take it down to avoid the hassle and the PR nightmare. Wow, this is not gonna endear me to Facebook, but that's fine.
A
little frank.
Don't worry, Maggie. They've hired plenty of former Facebook critics. I wouldn't be too worried about your future.
I'm not trying to get hired by Facebook. I just don't really want them to be out to get me either.
Yeah, this is, after all, we live in a capitalist society, right? And all companies at the end of the day are trying to make money. So, that's just how it works.
I guess one thing I will say is it doesn't seem like there is an easy answer. I don't really think that taking down the Chinese government tourism pages and not allowing them to advertise on Western social media is the right solution to the problem. I think that, a lot of the moves that would be taken would be seen as intentionally trying to cripple China's economic development, intentionally trying to make it harder for Americans to travel to or have interest in or understand China. I think that would also be a really problematic outcome if fewer Americans, or if we view every time a Chinese airline pops up on your Facebook page that's, China's out to get you or whatever, that's also not the desired outcome. And it's going to lead to greater competition and greater feelings of hostility, which is obviously not the desired outcome in the long run.
So do you have any policy prescriptions at the end of all this? There's this massive change in the last few years, and we're struggling how to deal with it. But what are your thoughts on that?
The flags, like the state-owned media outlets and the ways of tagging content, is definitely an improvement. They're very small and in like little gray at the very top of those posts, which I think is maybe not the most effective. If you talk to a psychologist about what someone's going to see in that image as they scroll past, it's not going to be the state-owned media flag. So maybe trying to work on really leaning into that initiative that they're working on and trying to follow through a little bit more on that. Definitely being more proactive about flagging content as political. I think a lot of times their tourism content is not flagged as political because, it's tourism advertising. But when it's talking about things like China's governance in a region, I do think that deserves the moderator once over, which it deserves to be kept in Facebook's ad library, which if it's not political, it will be kept after it's been run. And so all these tourism advertisements are gone. They're not visible anymore to researchers trying to figure out what's happening. Work on the transparency there. And I'm hoping just public awareness. Like, this is something that's happening. Not necessarily, it's not the end of the world. It's not this giant malign, campaign that's out to try to change the way that Western democracy works. That's not what China's trying to do, but there's something to be aware of when you consume media.
Maggie, I just want to sort of acknowledge that you are more articulate than many folks twice your age who've come on this show. So congratulations as the inaugural winner of this contest. Your essay has inspired me to just work harder to keep this up, because it's a real honor, I think, to be able to get the chance to highlight sort of up and coming talent in this world. So keep doing what you're doing, and can't wait to have you on again the next time you do something this important and impactful, which I know you will.
Thank you so much for having me. This was very fun.
牡丹牡丹牡丹牡丹，我侧脸想象会飘桃源，红染黄了毕业花更鲜艳，这风和点惹了一身偏见。牡丹牡丹牡丹牡丹，寒风中刚好是我的假面，最美丽的姿态穿过沉淀，从我内心又冲过一片片。开眼前的雨滴，红发的真小心，飘美若似雨，眼角的最秘密，笑出了他的心，也许他是走着踩着一下音，又无缘无尽，好似看透了一切云雾里。Everything's gonna be alright， 想要扣的还是两闪闪。当年总是为了苦你赶来，到了终点我是火，他们是柴，总在心中木兰盛开，小心后等着他到来，相像和鬼的我都爱，快乐一样不用装除外。牡丹牡丹牡丹牡丹，我在脸上香味飘得好远，红灯黄的毕业花很鲜艳，这风热就惹了一身偏见。牡丹牡丹牡丹牡丹，寒风中刚好是我的想念，最美丽的姿态成功沉淀，通往内心又冲过一片片。牡丹牡丹，牡丹牡丹，哎，牡丹牡丹，Bambi Bambi。